get started.
I think we won't use a microphone if you guys can hear us. Okay, is that all right?
Well, I think we need it. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to use microphones. Welcome everyone to this really exciting and innovative panel, star-studded panel. Okay, following Dimple's wonderful talk on Monday on law and narrative, it picks up on many themes that she introduced in her talk, including how narrative affects our work with lawyers, affects our advocacy, and we have an amazing panel. I'm going to introduce everybody quickly, which is a shame because they all have bios that I'll use, so I hope you Google them and maybe meet with them after, maybe co-op with some of these organizations. But I wanted to get started with the conversation. And just a word on the conversation, we want this to really be a conversation. So we didn't actually ask our presenters to prepare. We just are going to start by posing a question, and we are each going to reflect on it for a few minutes. And we'll do some back and forth and some discussion among the panelists, and then we will open it up for discussion. But if in that early portion you have a burning question, Anthony, welcome to your panel. Sorry, we got started. So I'll just introduce everyone. What I was saying is that if you have a burning thought, please by all means put up your hand and we'll start the bigger conversation early. So as we mentioned, this panel is following up on Dimple Abichandani's talk on Monday on law and narrative. She's the executive director of the General Services Foundation and our wonderful Daynard Public Interest Visiting Fellow and Northeastern grad. Sitting next to her is Anthony Romero, who is professor of practice and performance at the School Museum of Fine Arts at Tufts University. Next to Anthony is Becca Hart-Holder, who's the executive director of NARAL Program, Massachusetts, and my former friend from law school.
Still in a terrible calling.
And then we have HEMA SARANG-SIEMINSKI, who's a senior staff attorney at the Victim Rights Law Center, JUDY, who is co-founder and former executive director of Our Bodies Ourselves and current chair of the board of directors of Our Bodies Ourselves, and SHANNON, who's the executive director and founder of the Muslim Justice League. So I thought we could get started today, kind of reflecting on the big question that Dimple posed in her talk, which is how narrative affects your work as lawyers and as advocates. And maybe I'll do the mic over to you, Shannon, and then we can go down the road and everyone can take a few minutes. I'll let you know if you've gone over 5 minutes. Take a few minutes to just reflect on that big question, and then we'll ask some more.
Thanks so much, AZIZA. Thank you so much for including me in this huge panel. It's really awesome discussion. I'm excited to hear from it. So as AZIZA shared, my name is SHANNON. I'm one of the co-founders of Muslim Justice League and also the current executive director. And our work focuses on advocacy for human and civil rights that are threatened under national security pretexts. You can imagine we've got an expanding area of work right now, but when we were founded incorporated in 2015, this was pre-Trump administration, and there was already a need for this work. And the issue of narrative is relevant in particular to our main focus, which is combating or trying to end a program called Countering Violent Extremism. You can hear even in the name of that program suggestions of narrative, right? The suggestion that, of course, if you are opposed to something called Countering Violent Extremism, you must be a pretty scary actor. Why would you oppose something that sounds so positive? And yet the narratives that are used to advance this program are really not empowering for our communities. Basically, it's a program that is premised on the idea that you can prevent someone from becoming, quote, radicalized if you can identify the warning signs before they happen. And yet these warning signs are pseudoscientific and they're very common things like increased religiosity, becoming involved in a Muslim civic organization, being concerned about foreign policy, really expansive factors that invite use of implicit bias. And because the people being recruited to participate are not, police and intelligence agents, those agencies are already involved in driving the program, but are actually civilians social services providers, mental health providers, educators, school counselors. The narratives used to advance the program are not ones that are facially offensive, shall I say. They're not narratives like, help us spy on your patients and let us know if they have their own policy views or, foreign policy views. There are things like, we want to help you help vulnerable youth. We want to help protect youth who might be at risk of violent extremism without actually defining what violent extremism is. Right? And so we push back against the idea that our communities or any suspect community deserves resources because they need to be reformed or repaired or there's something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. So we really try to put forward narratives about self-determination, about the need for equitable investments across all communities, not premised on ideas that some of us are susceptible to becoming terrorists or gang members or criminals or anything like that. And we also have to challenge the good Muslim, Muslim narratives, which I think have become really entrenched through the domestic war on terror, as understandably, a lot of folks feeling fear due to being under scrutiny by extreme added surveillance, find themselves having to explain, I'm cooperative. I like the FBI. I come into my house and I'll offer you tea if you visit, right? We want to find the bad guys too. We can tell you where they are. They're just us. So we really have to push back against those impulses and help people to feel safe, standing together and seeing themselves as deserving of equal rights.
Thank you. So my organization, founded almost 50 years ago, Boston Women's Helpful Collective, but now it's known as Our Bodies Ourselves, which is what everybody called the group anyway. And it grew out of the Women's Liberation Conference in May of '69, almost exactly 50 years ago, not far from here, at Emmanuel College. And the story of why this happened at a Catholic women's school is another story that we can tell sometime. But the group that met at one of those workshops at that conference continued to get together and to look at the particulars of their lives. And they chose to focus on healthcare and sexuality. They were particularly concerned about the condescension, sexism, and paternalism that was in the medical field. At that point, 98% of all OBGYNs were men, 92% of all physicians were men, and their training was so dysfunctional. All you have to do is look at the textbooks that the residents and the medical students were exposed to understand why there were these attitudes. So the women who came together really upset about their own personal experiences. And these were largely college-educated women. And this particular group was largely white, middle class, though not completely. And of course, over the years, both the group and the whole women's health movement, as we call it, changed quite a bit over time. But what is fascinating is that the issues, which were front and center then, many of them have been addressed in good ways. And the narratives of patients and consumers are more front and center now in many of the medical debates. And some of the things that brought us together, like access to contraception and abortion, are more threatened than ever. So we've made lots of strides in a good direction, and in other ways, we have been stepped back very seriously. So over the years, the organization changed the language of its mission. And although we were best known for the iconic book, Our Bodies Ourselves, now it's the 9th edition, named by the National the Library of Congress as one of 88 books that shaped America, and it's gotten a lot of notoriety. The work of the organization around advocacy and connecting women's groups globally, many of which came to us and said, we want to do something like that for women in our region, in our country. And if you go to our website, you'll see these 30+ projects in so many exciting countries and locations, and the women's groups who produce their own culturally adapted translations of Our Bodies Ourselves are doing advocacy work as well as providing this kind of information. The quality of, and I would say the core characteristic of both Our Bodies Ourselves and all of these other publications around the globe is that they have brought together what we had gathered as the best evidence-based information, some of which is still not adequate or complete, combined with the narratives and stories of women themselves. And that's really the heart of our bodies ourselves, is looking at your own direct experience, the problems you experience, the challenges you face, and what you need to do to solve that. And sometimes it's about personal decision-making, and sometimes it's about organizing at the community level, state level, national level, so that you change policies that affect the lives of women, children, families, everybody. And it's that particular quality of our work, our advocacy work, the work we do with other groups, the collaborative nature of this work, is a hallmark of our efforts to advance the health and human rights of women and girls globally, which is the description.
I'm HEMA, SARANG-SIEMINSKI, and I've been a bit at the Victim Rights Law Center for 2 years now, but my background has primarily been in the space of looking at various forms of sexual harassment and survivorship, and primarily looking at the way in which we as lawyers, well, my practice area has immigration in the past, looking at the way in which we as attorneys can utilize our awareness of institutional biases, of the various systems of oppression that operate, to then integrate that into our legal practice. So the Victim Rights Law Center has been around since 2003 and really came out of the Boston Area Rape Crisis Center as the first civil legal services dedicated to provide civil legal services for survivors of. And I think historically the primary avenue that folks thought was available to survivors of sexual assault was really, there was a focus on the criminal justice and those processes that were available. And the reality is that the range of services that survivors needed, from housing to education assistance, immigration support, issues of benefits, really there's so much more beyond the criminal. That's how we came into being, and part of our work is really doing also training and technical assistance to attorneys across the country on best practices for working with survivors of. So I think that is, to me, where this conversation about narrative lies. So when we think about, as we talk about attorneys across the country doing work with survivors, we see the realities of a legal system that is very much entrenched in the narrative of rape culture. Narratives of what masculinity looks like, what femininity looks like, what survivorship looks like, what rape is, what sexual assault is and isn't, who is credible, who isn't. And there is a temptation, I think, among attorneys to, and sometimes a mandate for some folks, to take the avenue that is the most advantageous for a particular survivor. And some of my work in this space is challenging attorneys to think beyond that temptation can fall into traditional narratives that replicate some of the very forms of oppression that are at the root of. How can we use and transform the narratives that exist in the legal system to begin to resist rape culture? So this, to me, in my work, the way I think about survivor-centered lawyering, it's really a type of lawyering that seeks to kind of identify the messages behind the message when we're talking about sexual violence, the messages we received about who is to be credible and who isn't, and kind of shifting the narrative and using that as a way to push our work forward.
I'm Becca Hart-Holder, and I run NARAL for Choice Massachusetts. It's an organization that was founded in Massachusetts before Roe. In 1969, it was incorporated a year before Roe. And one of the main charges of the organization was to repeal the Massachusetts pre-Roe criminal abortion from the 1840s. That we achieved last year. It took over 45 years to do. And as a lobbyist and an advocate, I have to constantly relearn that being good at my job is about A, being good at relationships, and B, being good at school. And when Justice Kennedy retired in June, saw an opportunity at NARAL. We had been talking for the previous 6 months about the danger of a criminal abortion ban and our fears around it. And part of that was because there has been a larger project in the U.S. to repeal criminal abortion bans because they unfairly target women who are doing self-care. Those abortions often happen in communities where there's low access to information and are particularly common in communities of undocumented. And there was a woman in Massachusetts in 2007 who attempted a self-managed abortion and was indicted by a jury under our pre-Roe criminal abortion ban. Ultimately, the case was pled down, but this law was used and recently in Massachusetts punished women for abortion care. So as Justice Kennedy retired, I think many of us felt a lot of fear around what the future of reproductive freedom would be across the country. We saw it as an opportunity to get this onerous law off. It was a way that Massachusetts could act. And the legislature in Massachusetts is overwhelmingly male. I can't remember the percentage. I want to say it's 7%. That's the lowest that it's been, and it's also overwhelmingly capped. So these are often really difficult conversations to have. Sometimes with people who are open to having them, but they really have a hard time ever getting. In the course of lobbying to get this law repealed, I was speaking with a very powerful member of the legislature, and I was having the worst lobbying visit of my entire life. I mean, I was getting nowhere. I've been doing this for 10 years. It was a wall. There was nothing. I could not get through to him. Until I realized I hadn't told him the story. I had just been giving him facts. I hadn't explained to him how real people could be impacted by this law. And I told him the story of the undocumented woman. And everything shifted. Everything. He just saw it from a different perspective. He saw it from the lens, for that moment, from the frightened lens of what it must have been like for her. And it was a major breakthrough, and I think he was, getting him to put himself in her shoes for 2 minutes is one of the things that got that law passed, or got it repealed, because it became something that wasn't, oh yeah, whatever, that law's never going to be enforced here in Massachusetts anyway, this really isn't really understanding the jeopardy that people would face if this law were came up. So I think if you're thinking about lobbying, if you're thinking about advocacy, you have to learn storytelling, because you just simply will not be effective at your job if you can't tell.
Thank you. It's such an honor and privilege to be here. Excuse my hardness. I was teaching this morning, my students were having a hard time. Sure. This is wont to happen in classes. My name is Anthony, as was said, and I'm an artist. That typically means that I work as an individual, although my work is highly collaborative. I work in culture in part because, as Nato Thompson, the writer and curator, says, we make culture as much as we are made by culture. And I think this is part of what you were talking about a moment. So the idea that the kinds of change that I'm thinking about, while I am concerned with the pragmatics of what it looks like in terms of policy and law, particularly with the new project here in town, I'm also interested in how we shift culture, right? How do we create these kinds of experiences, these sort of performances and events, which reveal other kinds of narratives, other kinds of experiences. I'm primarily concerned with historical narrative, in part because I think it's by retracing the past that we better understand the shape of the present and can speculate about the future. Art for me is one of these opportunities where we can simultaneously imagine and enact that alternative. And for me, that's a big part of why I work in performance. It's a big part of why I work in community engagement, because people need to be in the room together, right? We need to work. The work at its core is about organizing bodies in space and across time in order to produce those imaginaries and then enact something in the wake. So that was a lot of words. Here's what it looks like as an example. In 2015, I was working on a project for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago with the Mexico City-based artist collective, the AL-WAKEEL. We were working on a project with Mexican immigrant and Mexican American community in the south of Chicago. We weren't sure what we were doing, and that's part of the process, that's part of the ethics of working with a community in this way. We were meeting with a lot of folks, and we knew, because of our connection with each other, that we wanted to tell a story about migration, that we were concerned with the border, we were concerned with kinds of rhetoric that was already starting to percolate into policies that, for myself, as someone who grew up in the borderlands, could see containing the movements of, say, my parents, even outside of what we typically think of as an architecture, right? Those sorts of architectures extend far beyond camp or the detention center, and are really built into the fabric and culture of these communities along the borderlands. So we got a call one day while we were working at the museum from an elder in the community who was very concerned because a cultural center that had historically been a very important place for community organizing and education in the community, that was part of a number of centers which was established in the wake of the Chicano Civil Rights Movement, when activists and organizers were moving from the Southwest to places like the Midwest to start organizing there. That building had been sold and was starting to be demolished. She was very concerned about this, as you might imagine, and she asked if we could do anything to save or otherwise prevent this demolition. The place is called Casa Aslan, after the historical home place of the Mexica or Aztec peoples, which is at Southwest Borderlands corridor. So the building had been sold many years before, and investors were really just sitting on it until they felt like the wave of gentrification in this neighborhood had reached a pitch loud enough for them to move on the building and demolish. So we went down there and we began talking with folks who started to gather and protest the building, and we documented the events, and we documented the building to the best of our ability before it was demolished. It was demolished thereafter and is now been replaced by a huge condo building. So why do I tell the story? I tell the story in part because it allows for that cultural memory to continue to exist. That's what we think of in the arts as a kind of performative utterance, right? It does something to tell that story. Because the anxiety of the elders of that community wasn't, as she very frantically pleaded to us, was that that place would be erased, that they would be erased. And the building becomes a stand-in for the bodies of the people who live in that community and for the body of the community. So to see that erasure of that building is to watch oneself disappear. So for me to come into this room and tell this story, as I typically do when I give talks, although I would be showing documentation most of the time, is a way for that thing to continue to evolve, right? And to create a kind of living memorial to that place and those people in that. Now, there are other things that we would do with that material. We take that material and it becomes incorporated into the performance in other ways, in the same ways that all of these stories of displacement and migration collected along the way would. But its form is really dictated by context and by communicating that sense of place and of displacement that we were really trying to get at.
Thank you so much for all of your stories. So I'm Dimple Abichandani. I spoke with many of you on Monday. So I had something I was going to say, say, but now listening to all of you, I'm like, this is what's hard about going last is that I'm inspired to say other things as well. So let me start by saying that I saw it as an amazing opportunity when I got the call from Northeastern to come back and address all of you. Really, the question in my mind was, given this moment that we are in, what's the most important thing to talk to you about? And I didn't say this in my talk on Monday, but and I don't want to sort of bring a darkness to like the lightness that we have here. But this is a really critical moment in time. And all of you are entering the field of justice. And I felt like it was really important to share with you that there's not one tool that's going to get us out of this mess. And that we actually need to look with a fresh set of eyes at what has got us here. And then what are the things that are holding us back from realizing our full potential as a society. And I did share this story on Monday, but I'll share it again. In my own work, the place that I started to think about narrative was in work that I was doing around Islamophobia. So in 2008, I started a funder collaborative, and our purpose was to actually try to address all the many kind of ways in which our civil rights and civil liberties have been rolled back in the name of the war on terror. And very few people were looking at the Islamophobia that had really already started to seep into our culture. And so then that ended up becoming a kind of entry point for us. We funded litigation, we funded grassroots organizing, we funded strategic communications, which is basically like messaging work, right? And by 2010, it was clear to me that even though we had had some wins, we were up against a deep narrative that took an entire, very diverse community and said this community is a national security threat. This is where I want to build on something that I heard, and this is kind of this is like my personal story. In 2010, I did something that lawyers often do. I was invited to a meeting about the beginnings of the CVE program. And this was a meeting with the Director of National Security, the Director of Intelligence. It was the most senior national security and intelligence people. We even got Janet Napolitano coming in and welcoming us. It was basically a group of 6 foundations. We were the only 6 foundations that were funding this. And they called us to Washington. They said, we want to have a really important conversation with you. And the conversation was basically them telling us about the national security threat that was posed by Muslim radicalization in the United States. They showed us a slideshow. They talked to us about all of their intelligence, although, I mean, once we asked 1 or 2 questions, it was really their hypothesis, right? And then they talked to us about this program, CVE, that they were planning to roll out. And I mean, I remember sitting back, listening to this, knowing what this was going to mean for the Muslim community, because, they were trying to disguise it, this program of incredible surveillance as a midnight basketball effort. I mean, really, right? I sat back in my chair and I could see the influence of things like Homeland. I could see the influence of 24, right? Where the nice Muslim family next door actually happens to be terrorists. And it was driving policy, it was driving where resources were going, and we could see what it was doing in the community. So the personal part of the story is that was in 2010. Fast forward to today, and I'm going to tell you about something that I fund, and you're going to say, oh my God, a lawyer is funding that? So I mentioned that we are starting to invest in popular culture strategy, right? We're trying to figure out how do you reach masses of people with new ideas about who people of color in this country are? We are funding a fellowship for a woman named Zara Nurbach, who is a comedian. If you look at the impact that comedians like AZIZA Ansari, Hassan Minaj, and others have had in terms of reaching millions of people, if you would look at what they're talking about the war on terror, but it's on Netflix and it's funny and it reaches people and it makes people think differently about this moment in time. And so we're funding this woman Muslim comic and the work that she's doing for something that we think is going to get picked up by Netflix. And it's not something I would have done a few years ago, but I actually think that right now it's really important that we try new approaches and that we add new approaches to the tried and true things that we do. And that's not to say that litigation is not so important, it's critical. But it's to say that I think we have to have a sensitivity to culture, to arts, and to this like bigger mix that we are all in, that is really informing what happened. And I'm just gonna say one more thing, and I promise to go with Mike. So for me, a highlight this week has actually been the conversations I've had with students. Northeastern students are amazing. And I don't see these two students, if I'm wrong, please raise it. But I had two students come and talk to me yesterday about their experiences working within legal services around veterans issues. And the question that they kind of posed to me was, or sort of the story they shared was, they said, you know, in doing this work, there was a way in which when we defended veterans, we were perpetuating this really damaging narrative about the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor. And they said, you know, how do we begin to shift that? And how do we think about a different way to frame those clients? And my answer to them was my answer across all the issues that we work on these days, which is that we need to have a new narrative, not about who those clients are, but about who we are in this country, in this time. We need to have a new narrative that's about us as a pluralistic society. We need a narrative about us as a very wealthy country where we care for one another and where we take care of one another, right? And I could say much more, but I really think that I want to offer that to all of you as you're thinking, because I think that our default in lawyering is to think about how we frame our clients. And so I don't know if that shift was helpful, but what we need to do a lot more now is frame the client in the context of who we are.
So I have a million questions for each of you that I scribbled down, but I also want to make sure to open up to the audience. I mean, I received a very strict email from Lucy telling me that we have to open up, and I should also take this moment to thank Lucy for all of your hard work in the community and bringing Dimple here for us to be able to have this conversation. So do you guys have any questions or thoughts or comments or reactions? I'll pose one and then you guys can open. Brian.
Thank you guys so much. I appreciate all your stories and all, right? Is there any specific advice for shaping narratives in more stateful context? Because being somebody from Virginia, I think it's important to start on the micro level on certain issues, and then maybe we can expand to like the more national level in some instances. But I think it's important to focus on specific communities that have certain concerns. So any advice in that regard?
You know, what happened last night reminds me of lessons learned. Stacey Abrams was an excellent choice because she has a personal narrative that could reach so many people in this country. And at the same time, she had some very powerful zingers. They may have been one-liners. But she kept to the personal narrative as the sort of powerful force behind policy statements and changes she made. And I think that, for me, choosing who your spokespersons are at a given moment in time is key here. And being able to have that person share a narrative that is compelling, that will lead to a conclusion that X, Y, and Z policy change is what we actually need. I can give later on 3 or 4 very good examples of how people's stories turned around policymakers, sort of like you were just sharing. And one of them is around the sort of the midwifery bill, which is legislature for more than 15, 20 years, but it's going to pass this session, and I believe in large part because of the powerful narratives that have reached legislature. So that's all I'll say for now. But that's one thing I felt that the Democratic Party did well last night in choosing Stacey Abrams. It's not just you can't pick someone running for the presidency. It's really about who would be the most authentic, articulate, and compelling spokesperson for the many, many causes, issues, and how do you go after somebody whose narrative is full of lies all the time? So you're dealing with someone who has false narratives day in and day out, and that's actually quite new. There's so many false narratives, one after the other, from a leader in a very powerful country. I mean, you see it all over the place, but this is like, how do you keep up with that?
I worked in federal policy and advocacy for a long time, and I got very disillusioned by working on reproductive health rights and justice on the federal level. And I made a really conscious decision to start working in Massachusetts in my backyard. And that is a decision I will never regret, because Massachusetts was the first state to legalize same-sex marriage, and then it was the first state to pass universal health care, and then the nation. Massachusetts leads on many issues, not every issue, but many issues, and then is the policy laboratory for the rest of it. If you came to NARAL tomorrow and wanted to go see your state senator, I could get you in this week. If you tried to do that on the federal level, it would take forever. You can have a very, very profound impact on the narrative that legislators are telling themselves, the narrative that they understand on certain issues, and you can do that fast and effectively. So, I am a real acolyte. It's funny, in law school, I remember Goodwin Liu was my common law professor, and I went to him, and I was like, the state, God, I hate the state. Like, it's the federal law. We should just be focused on federal law. We live in a different world now. And the states have so much power. We have so much power to shape the narrative. We have the privilege to have that power to shape the narrative. So I just want to encourage that instinct. Go to, if it's Virginia where you want to work, get involved with a local organization in Virginia, and you can get in the door fast.
When you mentioned the word micro level, that is for me that, and I think this work starts one-on-one and can very much start, for folks who are interested in the direct legal services work. This work starts there, and one of the exercises that I do with attorneys is, after sort of an overview of the various levels of oppression, looking from kind of the institutional or the dominant narrative generally, working down from kind of institutional forms of oppression, and then interpersonal forms of oppression, and looking at the impact on individuals who experienced all of that. The reason for kind of laying that foundation is to help attorneys understand that those narratives, that is what informs narrative. Those narratives are alive and well when we're talking about a survivor at the intersection of oppressions, experiencing white supremacy from the dominant cultural context, and then through institutional interactions, and then through kind of the commentary that happens from the individual who sexually assaulted them to everything that they're holding as a result. One of the exercises I do is kind of lay out this story, a case hypothetical of a young genderqueer person who's living in a rural area, person of color, immigrant, and They are sexually assaulted during a pool party. And they're young, they're 16, and following the assault, there's kind of social media. It's very typical scenarios for many of the survivors. Social media commentary about their sexuality, their gender identity, upholding the narratives of the perpetrators who are focusing on their gender expression over the assault, and putting it out there to lawyers. Well, what are you going to do if this survivor walks into your office? What is your obligation? How do you shift the narrative of a courtroom or an adjudicator, which is very much going to be, this kid's in trouble, confused, person who's not able to adjust to the U.S., all of that coded language, coded with, what if we flipped that script and said that, this individual is experiencing sexism, anti-immigrant sentiment, transphobia, white supremacy? What if we flipped that script? What would that feel? What power do we place back in the individual? And how can that inform our legal strategy? What creative strategies can we include? For example, we introduce expert testimony in ways that we never thought we would. What opportunities are that? So I think it can start on a very micro level and certainly completely transform survivor experience in navigating this.
Okay.
Just briefly, it's really exciting to hear you flag, your interest in local work, and I think that not only are there opportunities to make policy change that can really, lead the way and ignite interest and imitation in other cities, but there's a real opportunity to create narratives collectively across communities. So a little bit of background in my prior work before Muslim Justice League, I actually was state policy director for an organization called ERWIN. It's just Immigrant Refugee Advocacy Coalition, where I did a lot of lobbying. Still do a little lobbying, registered lobbies, but nothing like I used to, and it was usually a lot of defensive lobbying, unfortunately, although lots of measures we're trying to pass, we're constantly trying to beat back anti. So I grew very accustomed to sort of spotting the sympathetic victim to be harmed by a given proposal, right? And sharing that narrative with policymakers in a way that was really not, it was sort of like the least radical story necessary, just to give them an excuse to vote against it, right? And it was useful, right? But it didn't really advance the ball in terms of educating policymakers about what communities see as a vision or a narrative that they would like to describe our society or come, towards a more just and equitable world, right? And so now in our work with Muslim Justice League, I'm really happy that we have opportunities to, we're less focused on immediate defensive measures. We're kind of working on a longer game, and we've worked in collective through, for example, something called OSCO, which is a collective of different community activists and organizations that we actually initiated because we wanted to sort of, test our ideas, our hypotheses about what we're working on and the narratives we're using and the policies we want to see in community with other impacted groups. We didn't want to just say, this is what we want and not talk with, Movement for Black Lives folks and undocumented youth and other groups that are also experiencing criminalization because we didn't want to unintentionally throw them under the bus or use narratives that were what they wanted. And through that collective, we've really been engaging in a lot of shared learning and shared building of stories and with sort of policy change being the last thing that we're going towards. But I think it's an exciting time to kind of work intersectionally because we can't afford in this moment to be working in silos. So that's what I share as well.
It's quite a lively question. You're just moving so nicely across the group. One is a local resource, which is the Design Studio for Social Intervention. now, but they just got through doing, so they're social justice folks who apply design. They're located here in Dorchester, and they just got through running a series of workshops over the course of the week with folks working on various issues in their communities from across the country to workshop campaigns at their studio, including several groups from Atlanta who ended up running campaigns around the Super Bowl in Atlanta, and actions in relationship to Super Bowl and displacement and those kinds of things. So there are local resources who very often kind of offer these opportunities to and get feedback on campaigns, which is something that doesn't always happen. The other thing I wanted to pin to it, which is related to methodology, is that the feminist indigenous scholar E. Tufts reminds us that normative theories of change, which presuppose that change happens progressively, that it always be about progress, and that it always be centered on individuals who are situated adjacent to or slightly outside of communities who have to power or resources or what have you, reinstantiate and support colonial values, right, of domination, of individuality, privilege, resistance to a kind of collectivity. And her point is to remind us that to decolonize that way of thinking, we can think about how we might communally or collectively enact that change together. And to think alternately about change, not just as a kind of progressive event, but maybe as a revolution, right? Or a kind of horizontal landscape. So to that effect, I think one of the things that is useful for us to think about if we are trying to identify needs or campaigns or opportunities is one, to sort of assess resources, and then to provide platforms where communities can sort of self-determine what it is that might be the most useful for them. I think that's particularly true on a micro level. Like, what is an individual block trying to think through? Are they trying to think through zoning restrictions? Are they trying to think through job security? Are they trying to think through childcare or just healthcare? Like, I think it's particularly crucial on kind of local level because these issues can localize themselves on a block. That's right.
This is reminding me of one of the areas where our bodies ourselves and some other groups have gotten very deeply involved in both advocacy, but also creating best practices in a field that's totally unregulated, and that's the global commercial surrogacy field. Multi-billion-dollar industry, totally unregulated. And the false narrative that, unfortunately, was partly created by Oprah Winfrey, who's in the show, suggesting that all these poor women in India were going to have so much money and be able to pay for schooling for their children, and they can, give birth to these babies for richer couples in, Europe and Australia and the United States, and it's portrayed it as a win-win situation. It is much more complicated than that, and our close colleague in Delhi, India, SARANG research group, the Women in Health, recently commissioned a film called Can We See the Baby Bump, Please? And we can get you a copy if you want to look at it. It's about 40 minutes. And there are others. There's a commercial film called Made in India by two New York filmmakers, one Indian woman, one American woman. What happens, though, is that the commissioning parents, or the intended parents in places like the United States, who are seeking so-called surrogates, and I prefer to call them gestational mothers, because they're not surrogates, they actually give birth, but they're paid surrogates, that the parents who are engaged in these arrangements do not have a full understanding of what's going on, largely because of the false narrative created by the brokers, the people, the middle persons, who are creating these arrangements and making a lot of money. In the meantime, the women themselves who give birth, who put in the most of the labor, are not getting much money at all. Sometimes they don't get what they're promised to begin with. Telling the stories of these women, which this film does, and which a very important effort called surrogacy360.org, which I today, will reach the intended parents, those people who are fueling this industry, and create a more balanced narrative for them to make informed decisions about becoming parents through the mechanism of gestational surrogacy, paid gestational surrogacy. And we are not in the group of small group of feminists globally, particularly in Europe, who are calling to ban global commercial surrogacy. First of all, we don't think that'll work. But second of all, we want to respect the agency of women. If it's in a field and in a climate where their rights are respected and their access to both money and reasonable treatment, not being forced to stay in these homes and denied access to exercise and being forced to give birth by cesarean section, which the Indian government almost succeeded in passing, you do due diligence in an arena like this. You can have women choosing to do this, but having their health and human rights protected at the same time. We are finding that the narratives of these women are very compelling in changing the landscape and making them call for best practice.
Thank you. I'm going to open it up before I ask anything. Yes. And
I'm not from the law school, I'm a public health. And I run a group called the Institute for Health Equity and Social. And I'm sure this panel was passing me on. So first of all, thank you for broadening your scope. But my question is, I think will be relevant to law students as well. So many of us at the Institute do work across all of the domains you work in. And we have spent decades, many of us, struggling with this idea of whether the data and research we do can change narrative, and especially in this moment. And I'm listening to all of you talk about the false narrative, and then some of you use the phrase evidence, and right? And I'm curious if you have any guidance or advice for those of us doing the research, whether that be quantitative or qualitative, about how we can help change narrative, like how you've seen that work well in your experience. So I couldn't resist the temptation to ask that here.
Yeah, that's a good question too, just speaking.
My question is actually very similar in that I recognize the power the narrative has, and my concern is that we live in a world where one really well-told story, even when it's completely based on lies, can overpower the voice of thousands of stories. And so yeah, how do we both use narratives to shape the culture, but also get back towards truth and facts and statistics, and not just who can tell the best story?
Very quickly, so the work that we're doing, in terms of taking a look at the connections, oppression, and sexual, and I think it, when I look at the kind of presentations and conversations we were having, there is clear data that we have out there on the rates of victimization of folks of color, LGBTQ folks, we know that age, immigration status, identification, communities of color, all of the things that make somebody socially more vulnerable and less credible in society because of the lack of power that exists. We know that that increases rates of perpetration. I think that having that data, and I think that there could be so much more data that's specifically looking at some of those intersections, so that really formed the basis of our ability to take this to the next level, to talk about, how we now structure our learning in ways that can use some of that data and the reality of who's being victimized, and then ask the question of why and how do we challenge this.
I think we heard the president last night talk about banning abortion after, which has nothing to do with evidence or data. I think the answer, at least in my field, is it depends. It depends who you're talking to. It depends who your audience is. So you have a bill right now in Massachusetts that is a really visionary piece of legislation to repeal all barriers to abortion access in our state. And we have a 24-week ban in Massachusetts. So people who need care after 24 weeks typically have to fly to Colorado or New Mexico and get that and pay for that care, which thousands of dollars out of their pocket. The data suggests that only 1% of women and families seeking seeking care are getting it post-24. What matters is the story that the other side has been able to tell because they have captured it. What I think we are able to do in our advocacy is talk about, and I think we have to be really careful with it. I think we are able to talk about the tragedy that many face when they have a devastating diagnosis for their future child. And when you can see on the face of the person that you're talking to that you've got them, that's when you can talk about the data. That's when their mind has opened up to be able to hear a different story and a story that's based in fact and evidence in the type of work that public health researchers do. But for me, it's often opening the door with a story. Not always, there's always outliers who just want the data and they're great. But I think the storytelling is so important to seeding the ground to have the conversation.
Your questions are just both so relevant to our work. I wanted to comment quickly. So I will just note that the CVE program has been rebranded in the United States a few times using public health narratives in particular. We actually, let's take a step back. Federal prosecutors in Massachusetts had a pot of money for CVE grants to give to the community, and they tapped the Executive Office of Health and Human Services as a conduit for those grants. And we advocated along with other organizations, EOHHS, not to take the money because we felt it would really interfere with their mission, shall we say. And we actually have a public record email from the Federal Prosecutor's Office to EOHHS concerned about the fact that MJL and other activists were pushing back on this. And it specifically says, as you know, EOHHS's involvement in this program is so important so that this can be framed as a public health issue. So talk about narrative use. But I would just say that I do think that the research matters. And one of the biggest critiques of CVE is that it's not evidence-based. And it's been so widely, acknowledged at this point that even CVE proponents acknowledge that fact. But the problem is that they start out by saying things like, researchers know that there's no, definable pathway to radicalization, and then it operates the rest of the document is about, let's go after isolated youth or alienated youth or, premise that they don't even have to justify why those youth should be targets. I think, having evidence to point to is important, but I think we also need, to your point, a narrative that is at least as strong as the one story that is stuck in people's minds. And what we found helpful at MJL is because pointing out the gaps in reform, the lack of evidence can lead to a frustrating conversation where folks are like, well, we just need to fund more federally funded research about what the actual factors that show radicalization are. We end up in circles. We need to explain why the narrative of the vulnerable youth susceptible to radicalization is so powerful. The narrative that we should choose should be authentic. We don't want to just come up with something self-serving. And what we found is an authentic narrative that we put out there is there's a researcher, AL-WAKEEL, who has written a piece in a journal called Race and Class called Radicalization, the Journey of a Concept, which actually explains why Western powers governments, especially intelligence and national security agencies, have rallied around this idea of radicalization, that we need to stop radicalization, which traces it back to the occupation of Iraq, when there was violence against the occupation, and Western powers had to explain that violence in a way that pathologized it, that really made it different from what was to be expected, and it separated it from an interplay with state violence. Right, so this non-state violence was something, not to have been anticipated, and they anchored it in explanations about basically Muslims being susceptible to radicalization due to their religion, etc. Over time, that morphed to become more politically correct, and now it's just political views in general or religious views in general. Although we all know who we're talking about, with unspoken sort of dog whistles. But that's really helpful for explaining why a theory of radicalization was needed by these powers in order to explain violence by non-state actors in a way that didn't risk having to have a broader conversation about the relationship between state and non-state.
It's a really good question. I wanted to address the question that you posed over here about what do we do when there's, I'm paraphrasing what you said about like one loud false story or one loud false narrative. And I wanted to go back to something that I said on Monday, which is, at least in my work, when we're talking about narratives, we're usually talking about them at kind of the public level. And I know it gets confusing because we also, as lawyers, talk about narratives in the context of like the work we're doing, the advocacy, and the cases. So for me, the difference is like those public narratives, they're really just ideas. They're the very powerful ideas that have kind of taken hold in our culture and in our politics, and they get informed by many stories. So what makes something like a Make America Great Again narrative so powerful is all the ways that it's reinforced. If it was just one lie, it wouldn't have the same power, but it's the way in which it's reinforced across all the different issues that each of you have spoken about, right? It's reinforced, in our culture, in our pop culture, in our media, through all the many stories that people are telling. They all kind of speak to this set of ideas and reinforce them. And so your question of like, how do we start to get at that? I think in my experience, we at least start with an understanding. We try to pay attention to what are the kind of bigger prevailing narratives at play in whatever area I'm working in. And I think here, some of you talked about that in a very compelling way of understanding what's the bigger context, and then asking ourselves, do I affirm that? Is there some way in which I'm affirming that narrative? Do I need to think about a counter narrative? So this is something that I think in the immigration context, I think advocates really struggle with this because I would say the broader narrative around immigration right now is one of real othering. It's one of foreignness. It's it's a very racialized narrative. And then what on an individual case level, sometimes the choices that attorneys make for their particular client is to, for that client, tell a story that's about how good this immigrant is, right? But if you think about what is if you think about that as I talked about on Monday, kind of stories as stars and a narrative as being kind of the constellation, right? So where is that star? What constellation is that star sitting in? Of a story about a good immigrant. It's sitting in a broader constellation about most immigrants being bad. And that's the thing that I think maybe in a different time as lawyers we didn't have to grapple with it as much. I think right now we need to grapple with what are these constellations in which we are trying to represent our individual clients, and how are the stories that we're telling shifting or reinforcing these dynamics.
Being here. The point about so there's a lot of defensive narrative creation. Can you talk a little bit more about offensive narrative creation? That makes sense. Are there any sort of incipient emerging narratives that you're excited to tell that are not yet part of the public? And if so, what does that look like? Because I just feel like at the moment a lot of people in our community are focused on holding back to what we had. And there's very little room to imagine what we need.
So I'll just share a quick one and I'll pass it on. But I very quickly referenced one on Monday in my talk where I talked about the counter argument, the counter narrative to family separation, right? So we have all this stuff about crisis at the border, this MS-13 coming across, and I shared some work of one of our grantees, this narrative of families belong together. What's been fascinating is actually watching how that is not, it's not a defensive narrative, it's actually an affirmative narrative. It was started as a way to talk about family separation. It's a narrative that says, who are we as a country? We're a country that believes that families belong together, right? What's been really interesting is to see how it's moved out of the immigration context in a pretty short amount of time, and now people are actually using that same narrative to talk about mass incarceration and the impacts that you have on all of the families that are torn apart when we lock people up. You're seeing people use the families belong together narrative to talk about the child welfare and how is it that we think about how do we deal with the kids and the families as they go through that system. So it's been really interesting to see that it's developed somewhat as a counter narrative, but it's actually starting to have a life of its own, and it's doing what narratives do, which is narratives are organic. Narratives have a life of their own. So you can start a narrative, you can think about narrative, but then where it goes and what happens, it's in the realm of culture. So to me, it's been really interesting to see how that frame has had so much power and resonance that it's actually starting to be used much more broadly across social justice work.
I don't know what happens to my periods. There are two thoughts that I wanted to connect. One, of pop culture reference, which is Inception. So the movie Inception, which I watched between years, is that the Leonardo DiCaprio and co need to slip into someone's subconscious dream state and plant an idea. So there's a lot of discussion of what it means to plant an idea and the ways in which, in order for that idea to take hold, it needs to be organic. It needs to seem as though it came from the person who is asleep, right? The person who's subconscious there, speaking into. This struck me as not dissimilar from the sort of strategies and tactics that we're describing in regards to the counter narrative. And here's how. Because I think the kinds of narratives, the kinds of rhetoric that we are being assaulted with now seem organic to the right, to the alt-right, because they naturalize things like white supremacy, like European values, like colonialism, like domination. They continue a long legacy of justification. So family separation, right? The idea that folks who look like me, like brown folks, could be separated from their families, could be treated as objects, could be forcibly medicated, isn't a new idea, right? That's an idea which is imported from colonialism on. And it's in all sorts of policies. It's in the Repatriation Act, 1930s, that regardless of your citizenship, if you were not a U.S. citizen or appear to be, or if you're just even thought of as being Mexican, you were immediately deported, regardless of where if you speak the language or where you grew up. I mean, it's not that similar now. Even something like the Braceros program, right? That we will allow Mexican workers into the country, they will work here, and then they immediately have to leave. That's an idea that has nothing to do with them as people, and has everything to do with them as instruments, as harvest technology, right? You might as well be labs. So they come, they get activated in our fields, and then they get sent back to the garage. That's the same logic that allows them to be forcibly removed from each other and detained in all sorts of places around the U.S. So in order to build a kind of counter narrative, part of what's being undone is the systems that naturalize that rhetoric in the first place. Because that rhetoric is seen as justification and evidence for something that folks who believe those things already know to be true. The superiority of white cis male, for example, right? Those things are justified. And we see that too inside of the sort of rhetoric around monuments, right? Suddenly the sort of erasure of a history, a past, that there's a kind of anxiety, right, that is rooted in white supremacy that legacies run equally as deep through colonialism, right? That the idea that these objects that we are detaining, that we are quarantining, that we are instrumentalizing, profiting off of, will somehow become animate and overtake us, right? It's a Terminator scenario. And what could be scarier than like suddenly having all of these objects that we treated so terribly suddenly animating themselves and taking over? So part of the work of the counter narrative and sort of defense has to include, to my mind, in offensive unbreaking of these interconnected and interwoven systemic and ideological roots of this narrative.
Really quickly on that, I mean, I think the way to do some of that is through those kind of unconventional partnerships. In creating sort of, for example, in our office, I'm typically reaching out to public defenders for something or another to try to create partnerships, which I think to many folks in my office seems completely absurd. Is why would a representative attorney be partnering with public defenders? That is a narrative that needs to be the dichotomy between survivor and offender. We know that the system's harm. So let's kind of come together and deepen our vision for what we want and create a narrative that
I'll take a couple of points in. One is that getting the right person on your side or the right entity can be key. One of the things that's helped us is get famous people talk about, cultural icons. Christy Turlington Burns, who was a model on the cover of Vogue magazine, she's gone on to do other things, and she's the head of a group called Every Mother Counts, which is trying to reduce maternal mortality globally. But she is going to be more of a spokesperson and write something for our effort here in Massachusetts. We know that will help. We have found that, for a long time, organized obstetrics, Mass Medical Society, can dominate the narrative about the safety of home. Forget about whether it's a big vital decision. So for years, it was this is unsafe. Then we got past that because we actually have good data. And now it's about the qualifications of the provider in the home birth setting. And we are whittling away at that as well. But getting a larger number of credible spokespersons, not just the people having babies at home, but providers, heads of maternal fetal medicine, heads of labor and delivery, who are physicians saying this is the way to go, is key to moving this huge boulder. And there's another area where I just want to say we've been struggling to engage more of the right players. Think about the massive problem of gender-based violence. Well, there is a great magazine called Voicemail. How many of you have seen it? Voicemail magazine. It's out of Western Mass, and it's now the organ of the Men Engaged Project, which is UN affiliated and involves men's groups all over the world. And I mentioned there in that, but I'll get some to you. They have the narratives of men who have stepped up to the plate to either prevent or stop gender-based violence, and being very honest about how threatening and difficult this is, because you live in a culture where this kind of work is considered very, sissy-like. Very rarely do you get resonance from those around you. It takes a lot of courage to do this work, and I think when you get more and more of those players alongside, you should change the false narratives. You can get what ultimately you need, which is the political power. We got shot down in the 90s in no time by the insurance industry on the merits of single-payer healthcare. It's a wonderful story to tell, but it didn't take them much with those kinds of millions of dollars to shoot down all the narratives we had. It takes building a movement, which is sometimes one-on-one. Right now, we realize we have to go to legislators one-on-one to these stories, and you get them on your side, and then when you have enough of them and you have enough individuals calling them and saying this is what we want, you then get the political power that is ultimately your only antidote to this huge money that put out ads that mislead the public big time.
I think we have to wrap up because we're nearing the end of time. I'm so sorry that we missed your last question.
and go through to our site in one second. But I want to thank the panel, really, and you all are so busy, and you come here to reflect for an hour. Reflection and thank you, Dimple, for suggesting this as our topic of conversation, and for bringing all this Northeastern this week. And thanks, Lucy.
And we want to thank AZIZA for pulling this all together as well.